Well, tonight we're going to look at the last three kings of Israel. You may remember when we left off last Wednesday night, we had talked about a couple of these kings that came to power and did not reign for very long. We found essentially a king coming to power, someone not wanting that king to be in power, assassinating that king. That happened 2 times in a row in rapid succession. Another king came to power, King Menahem. He reigned for 10 years, and the only reason that he, by my estimation, was able to stay on the throne that long was because he was a very ruthless individual. But also, he had some agreements that he put into place because of tributes that he paid to Assyria that kept the Assyrians from coming in and doing battle with Israel during the time of his reign. But after 10 years, Menahem passes away, and his son, a man by the name of Pekahiah, comes to the throne. Very, very little is recorded about this man. 2 Kings 15:23 tells us that he only reigned for 2 years. During that time, all that's recorded is that he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Essentially, he continued down the same path that his predecessors had followed. But after 2 years, one of his military officers, a name of Pekah, he decided that he wanted the throne for himself, and so he amassed 52 men to go with him. They went into the palace or to the place where the king would live, and they went in and they carried out the assassination of Pekahiah. Well, at this point, Pekah becomes the king of Israel. Now, he would be the last king that would reign for a fairly lengthy amount of time. He would reign for a period of 20 years. 2 Kings 15 and verse 28, though, tells us that he essentially was the same type of person, the same type of king as his predecessors. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, walked in the ways of Jeroboam. But we find that one of the things that Pekah is remembered for, and I may be pronouncing that wrong, but that's the way that it looks like it should be pronounced. But one of the things that he involved himself with was he allied himself with the Assyrians, who were their sworn enemies. But the king of Assyria wanted to go and do battle with Judah. And so King Pekah, he allies himself with this king of Assyria named Rezin, and he goes to battle against Judah. Now, there's some speculation as to why he did this. I do not personally believe that the reason he did this was because he wanted to show loyalty to Assyria. I don't think that there were any good feelings whatsoever toward Assyria on the part of Pekah. But I do believe that what he was trying to do, he was trying to preserve as much of his kingdom and as much of his authority as he could. Now we know that this was not completely successful, for we find that during the 20 years of his reign, Assyria continued to come in and claim more and more of Israel's territory. And so exactly why he allied himself with Assyria, we really don't know. But we know that this, once again, was a sinful alliance because he allied himself with a heathen nation. But we also find that it's during the reign of Pekah that the first Israelite captives started to be carried away to Assyria. We find that this is really the initial steps of the fall of Israel, and ultimately they're being carried away into Assyrian captivity. But what this shows us is that regardless of what his intention was, regardless of what he thought was going to happen through this alliance, what this shows us, and we could use this as one of our applications, folks, it shows us that allying oneself with an enemy is never going to bring about something good. Allying oneself with someone who is evil is not going to bring about a good result. And so even if Pekah thought that by allying himself with Rezin and the Assyrians, that this was going to better the circumstances of Israel. We find that in the long run it didn't, because Israel continued to lose territory. People continued to be carried away as captives, and we find that their decline continued rapidly during this time. But we find that as time went by, Pekah continued to carry out things that people in that kingdom did not agree with. And as a result of that, a man by the name of Hoshea, he got together a group of people to rise up against Pekah. He led a conspiracy that ultimately led to Pekah's death in 2 Kings 15 and verse 30. At that point, Hoshea begins to reign over Israel. Now, something that is unique about Hoshea. There are some of the lists that you will see of the kings of Israel that do not include Hoshea. Many of those lists will end with Pekah. And the reason that is because Hoshea almost immediately, upon claiming the throne for himself, he goes and he surrenders himself to Assyria. He becomes a subservient king. Essentially, he still had certain authority, certain oversight over that kingdom, but ultimately he was giving his allegiance to the king of Assyria. And so many times people will say, well, this is showing that he forfeited that nation ended at the point that he gave his allegiance to Assyria. But that's not how we're going to look at this. We're going to say that he was the last king of Israel. And the reason that we're going to say that is because Israel continued to stand for another 9 years. Hoshea becomes king. He reigns for 9 years, ultimately before the kingdom is destroyed. It's carried away by Assyria. 2 Kings 17:1 says that Hoshea reigned for 9 years in Samaria. Remember, Samaria was the capital city of Israel at this time. But verse 2 says, he also did evil in God's sight, but not as the kings of Israel who were before him. So he was not quite as evil. He wasn't as wicked to the extent of some of the kings that had come before. But as I said, shortly after becoming king, he goes and he begins to pay tribute to the king of Assyria. And this was something that would often be done by the leaders of a conquering or a conquered nation. A nation would go in and would conquer another nation, but rather than putting their rulers to death and taking them under the oversight totally of the king of that conquering nation, they would be allowed to retain their government structure to some extent. They would be allowed to retain their kings. We see this especially whenever we get into the time of Christ. We see this with the Romans. There were kings that continued to reign over different areas of the Roman Empire. There were also governors who were appointed to reign. Certain people, like the Jews, were allowed to retain certain aspects of their government procedures. Well, what takes place is Hoshea begins paying tribute to Assyria. Ultimately, he's saying, yes, I'm still the king of Israel, but you are my king. I'm going to submit to whatever Assyria wants. But apparently, from the text, after a while, he begins to regret that decision. And so he goes to the king of Egypt, and he requests help from the king of Egypt to try to get out of this agreement. And so what happens is Israel stops paying tribute to Assyria. And at this point, the king of Assyria decides, this is the last straw. I gave you a chance. Everything was going good as long as you were paying tribute to me. We saw this during the reign of Menahem also. As long as they were paying that tribute to Assyria, Assyria was going to leave them alone. But now he's gone, and he's tried to get Egypt to come to his aid, to go to war, to separate them from that oppression that Assyria was beginning to put on them. And so what happens? The king of Assyria, he goes, he arrests Hoshea and has him thrown into prison. At this point, his reign comes to an end. He's in prison. He's no longer able to lead the people the way that he could when he was on his own. And we find that once Hoshea is in prison, Assyria then spends the next 3 years going through the land of Israel, conquering all of their cities, carrying the people away as captives. And ultimately what took place is Israel came to be conquered. But something that's interesting about this, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, a little bit later tonight. Once Israel fell, they were never allowed to reestablish themselves as a kingdom again. They were never allowed to come out of captivity, to go back and to reestablish their kingdom. They were never allowed the right to do that. When they were carried away by the Assyrians, they lost their identity. Now keep that in mind as we go along. So these captured Israelites, now of course many of them lost their lives, but the ones that survived, the ones that were taken as prisoners of war, they were carried back to Assyria, and there they were taken, and they were basically scattered throughout the possession of Assyria, throughout the land to different cities. But we find that even after all of this has transpired, even after they've lost their home, even after they've been carried away captive, they still will not honor God. They still will not recognize the error of their ways. And so God decides that He's going to do something once again to try to open their eyes. The Bible tells us that He sends lions into the places where they're living. And those lions go in and they begin to kill many of these former Israelites. Once again, hoping that this would open their eyes to their sinful condition and the need to change. Well, we find that after this begins, they go to the king of Assyria. They're wanting help. They're wanting to try to find some way, send in guards or something. We got to do something to try to keep these lions away from the people. Well, the king of Assyria does something that I find interesting and quite intriguing. Rather than sending his military, rather than sending guards, he sends a former priest. He sends a man of God to go into these places and to communicate to the people why this was taking place. The only way that we can explain that was a work of God. God was giving the people one last chance to change, to come back to faithfulness. Well, we find that the priest, he goes in, he begins to communicate with these people about God, and many of them, they listen to what he has to say. Many of them recognize the fact that they are being punished by God. The text says many of them began to fear God. But where they came up short is while they did begin to fear God, began to give more attention to God, they did not stop worshiping their false gods. So ultimately what they did, they just added the worship of God in with the worship of their false gods. To them, God was just another god. Now, another question that I don't have an answer for. God removed the lions. Why? The Bible does not tell us. He allowed the people to essentially continue to live on however they wanted from that point. And at the time that 2 Kings was written, we find that the Israelites were still in Assyria. They were still seen as captives, and they were still continuing this form of worship that they had established shortly after moving there. They were continuing in a way to worship God, but they were also continuing to worship false gods. Well, let's talk about some applications, and then I've got another subject I want us to talk about a little bit tonight before we move back into Judah with our next class. But let's look at some applications that we see from these last three kings. First, we find examples in multiple accounts with these kings that lifting your hand against God's anointed is not going to bring about positive benefits. It's going to bring God's judgment against you. You know, of the final 5 kings that we've talked about the last 2 weeks, 4 of those kings came to the throne by assassinating the previous king. Now, even though these kings, they weren't the descendants of David, they didn't have the same promise that those in Judah had, these kings were still God's anointed king. These were the ones that were in that position of leadership. And so, as these men came in and they carried out these evil tasks of killing these previous kings to claim the throne for themselves, ultimately what you had was you had 4 out of the last 5 kings who did not have God's approval. And it's my opinion that that's why 4 out of the last 5 kings didn't reign very long. You notice the one that reigned for the longest amount of time was the one who had ascended to the throne when his father died. The one that ascended through just the normal course of succession. He didn't ascend through bloodshed and violence, but these others did. He was allowed to reign longer. You know, we find examples in the Old Testament of punishment being handed down when someone who had been anointed by God had some type of violence brought against them, either death or even some type of physical punishment brought against them. You know, for example, in 1 Samuel chapter 24, verses 1 through 10, you know, even though Saul at this time was hunting David, was trying to kill David, you remember, on multiple occasions, David had opportunities where he could have killed King Saul. Why didn't he? What's the subject we're talking about? Because Saul was God's anointed king. And so David would not take his life. And then you remember in the first chapter of 2 Samuel, when a man comes from the battlefield, comes to David and tells David that he is the one who has killed Saul. What did David do to that man? You remember? He had him put to death. Even though, you remember, Saul had committed suicide by falling on his own sword. This man came thinking that he was going to get the acclaim of killing King Saul. But David, he punished that man because he had killed God's anointed king. You know, we see numerous incidents of that. We also find reference in Acts chapter 2 when Peter is speaking there on the day of Pentecost, alluding back to this concept in talking to the Jews about them sending Jesus to the cross. And he talks about the fact that they had carried out a lawless deed because they had taken the Christ, the anointed one, and had put him to death. And if they did not repent, then they were going to face the vengeance of God. Another lesson that we see from this, and I tried to think of a better way to term this, but folks, there's always going to be someone stronger. One source that I looked at put it this way: there's always going to be someone with a bigger sword. You stop and you think about what happened in those last years of Israel. These last few kings lived and died by the sword. Everything was based upon violence and vengeance. But ultimately, a stronger nation. A nation with a bigger sword came in and conquered that nation. You know, we stop and we think, the kingdoms of this world rise and fall. You go back and you study history and you think about the great kingdoms that have been on the face of this earth that now lie in ruin. But you know, Daniel prophesied in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44 that even though the kingdoms of this earth are going to rise and fall, he said that there was a kingdom that was going to rise that would never fall. And that kingdom would be one that is not of this world. Talking about the church. Talks about the fact that it will never be destroyed. The kingdom shall not be left to other people. It says it will break into pieces and consume all the other kingdoms, and it will stand forever. We can't say that about Israel. And we're going to see in about another 134 years of history, we're not going to be able to say that about Judah. Because both of those kingdoms, even though they had been so richly blessed by God, both of those kingdoms were going to fall. And while there are many things that led to that, ultimately what it all came down to is they turned away from God. You may remember early on in these kings, how many times did we see God promising a king when they came to the throne, as long as you serve me, I'll take care of you. As long as you serve me, you're going to be able to reign, everything's going to be fine. But how many of those kings remain faithful? Very, very few. Very few.